It was early morning when passengers started boarding the luxury private jet.
What is it?
Everyone looked busy, tired, or in a hurry to get to their destination. Among them was a woman who didn't stand out. She wore simple clothes, plain jeans, a white shirt, and a small handbag. No expensive jewelry, no designer outfit, and no assistant carrying her luggage. She looked like an ordinary traveler, the kind most people wouldn't pay attention to. But there was something different about her presence. She walked, with quiet, confidence, calm and graceful, like someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The flight attendant, a young woman named Clara, noticed her and assumed she was just another passenger who somehow got a seat on this private flight. Clara didn't smile much at her. She was busy attending to other passengers who looked rich, men in suits, women with luxury bags, and people who made sure everyone noticed their status. Clara greeted them with warm smiles and polite words, offering them drinks and making sure they were comfortable. But when the simple woman passed by, Clara's tone changed. Her greeting was short, and her expression cold, almost dismissive. The woman didn't seem to care. She simply nodded, took her seat quietly near the window, and looked outside as the jet prepared for takeoff. She didn't use her phone or try to talk to anyone. She just sat there, peaceful and observant. A man sitting across from her noticed her calmness and smiled kindly, but she only returned a gentle nod. She was polite, but distant, like someone who had seen the world and didn't need to talk much to understand people. Clara, meanwhile, kept whispering to another flight attendant. "I don't know why she's here," she said in a low voice. "She doesn't look like she belongs on a private jet. Maybe someone pulled some strings for her." The other attendant shrugged. "Just do your job," she replied softly, but Clara kept glancing at the woman with judgment in her eyes. As the passengers settled in, Clara served drinks and snacks. She moved quickly toward the people she thought were important, offering them everything with extra care. When she reached the simple woman's seat, she didn't bother to ask what she preferred. Instead, she placed a cup of water on the tray and walked away without a word. The woman didn't complain. She just smiled faintly and whispered, "Thank you." Something about her calm tone unsettled Clara. It wasn't arrogance. It was the opposite. The woman's politeness, despite the rude treatment, made Clara uncomfortable. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because deep down she knew she was being unfair. The engines roared, and the jet began to move down the runway. The passengers relaxed, some talking, others closing their eyes. The simple woman kept her gaze fixed on the sky, watching as the plane lifted off. There was something peaceful in her expression, almost as if flying reminded her of freedom. For a brief moment she closed her eyes and smiled. A few minutes into the flight, turbulence shook the cabin slightly. Clara moved through the aisle, checking on the passengers. When she reached the woman, she noticed her seatbelt wasn't fully tight. "You need to secure your seatbelt properly," Clara said sharply. The woman nodded and adjusted it. "Thank you," she said softly again. But Clara wasn't satisfied. "Next time, listen carefully," she added, walking away with an irritated sigh. The other passengers noticed the tone but didn't say anything. The woman's calmness, however, began to draw quiet attention. Some of them started wondering who she was. Her face looked familiar to one of the older men on board, but he couldn't place where he had seen her before. During the flight, the woman took out a small notebook and began writing something. Her handwriting was neat and steady, like someone who'd written important things many times before. Clara passed by and gave her a quick, judgmental look, assuming she was some ordinary worker pretending to belong among the wealthy. What she didn't know was that the woman was reviewing notes for a major business meeting, the kind that decided the future of her multi-billion-dollar company. Hours passed quietly. The passengers began to relax more, chatting among themselves. But Clara's attitude toward the woman didn't change. Every time she passed by, she looked at her with subtle irritation. The woman remained patient, unbothered by the behavior. What no one on that flight realized was that this quiet, humble woman was the very reason they all had jobs. The jet they were flying on, the airline they worked for, it all belonged to her. But she had chosen to travel anonymously that day, without assistance or public attention, just to see how her employees treated ordinary passengers. The woman's assistant had begged her not to do it, but she wanted to understand the truth. She believed that real character was revealed when people thought no one was watching. So, she sat there quietly, letting the world show its true colors. As the plane flew through the clouds, she smiled slightly to herself. She wasn't angry or disappointed yet. She was just watching, learning, and waiting. She wanted to see how far people's arrogance could go when they believed someone was beneath them. What she didn't know was that this flight would soon turn into a lesson no one would ever forget. The air outside was peaceful, but inside that cabin, pride and ignorance were quietly brewing a storm that was about to explode, and when it did, it would change everyone's life on board forever. The flight was only an hour into the sky when things began to shift. Clara, the flight attendant, moved up and down the aisle with the confidence of someone who believed she was in charge. She smiled brightly at the wealthy passengers, laughing at their jokes, bending down to serve them with charm. But every time she passed the woman in simple clothes, her expression changed. The warmth in her face disappeared, replaced by cold disinterest, as if the woman didn't deserve the same respect. The woman didn't react. She sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, eyes wandering over the soft clouds outside the window. She looked peaceful, but inside her mind she was taking note of every detail, every word, every look, every action. She had always believed that true power didn't need to shout. It only needed to observe. When Clara returned to offer refreshments, she skipped the woman's row at first. The woman waited patiently, watching Clara serve everyone else. Finally, she lifted her hand slightly and said, "Excuse me, may I please have a cup of tea?" Her tone was polite, her voice calm. Clara turned, a hint of annoyance flashing across her face. "We're short on supplies right now. I'll see if there's any left," she said quickly and moved on. Minutes passed. The tea never came. The woman didn't ask again. She simply folded her hands and smiled faintly. Another flight attendant, Lily, noticed the situation and whispered softly to Clara, "Why didn't you serve her?" Clara shrugged. "She's not our priority," she replied. "These kinds of passengers are just lucky to be on this plane. Focus on the important ones." Lily frowned but stayed quiet. She had worked with Clara long enough to know how she treated people she thought were beneath her. Clara always assumed that money, fancy clothes, and loud confidence defined who mattered in the world. As the flight continued, Clara's arrogance grew. When a man in a designer suit called her over, she hurried immediately, her voice sweet and her smile flawless. But when the same woman quietly asked for an extra napkin, Clara's tone turned sharp again. "You'll have to wait. I'm busy right now," she said without even looking at her. The woman didn't take offense. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and said, "It's all right. Take your time." Her words were soft, but there was something in her eyes, a deep understanding that made Clara uncomfortable. It was as if the woman could see right through her attitude, as if she knew this wasn't the first time Clara had treated someone unfairly. For the rest of the flight, Clara kept finding reasons to avoid that passenger. But no matter how much she ignored her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this woman didn't fit the picture she had in her mind. The woman didn't act like someone poor or ordinary. She didn't complain, didn't try to impress anyone, and carried herself with quiet dignity that demanded silent respect. At one point, Clara overheard two passengers talking quietly about business. They mentioned a powerful female tycoon who recently bought a controlling share of the airline company. "She's young, brilliant, and nobody knows much about her," one of them said. "They say she travels sometimes without a team, just to see how her people behave." Clara chuckled under her breath. "Some rich people have strange habits," she said to herself, still unaware how close that statement was to the truth. Meanwhile, the woman took out her phone, opened an email from her company, and smiled slightly at the updates. The new aircraft deal had been finalized. The airline now had the potential to expand into 5 more cities. It was her vision coming to life, but no one around her knew that she was the reason this flight even existed. She leaned back, thinking about how she had worked from nothing, starting from a small office, facing rejection after rejection, building her empire step by step. She had promised herself that no matter how much money she made, she would never forget where she came from. That's why she chose to fly like an ordinary passenger today, to see the truth behind the smiles of her staff. But Clara's behavior was more revealing than she expected. The woman noticed not just arrogance, but also how quickly people changed, their behavior based on what they thought someone was worth. It wasn't about service, it was about judgment. When Clara passed by again, the woman looked up and said gently, "You seem stressed. You should rest a bit when you can. This job must be tiring." The kindness in her tone caught Clara off guard. For a moment, Clara didn't know how to respond. She forced a fake smile and said, "I'm fine. Thank you," before walking away quickly, feeling strangely uneasy. As the plane soared higher into the clouds, the distance between arrogance and humility quietly widened. Clara still believed she was the one in control of this cabin, but the truth was, she was unknowingly being tested by the very person who could change her entire future with a single decision. The woman looked out of the window again, her reflection staring back at her. She whispered softly to herself, "Sometimes people show you who they really are when they think you're no one." Her words disappeared into the hum of the engines, but destiny had already started writing the next chapter, one that would turn this ordinary flight into a lesson that neither of them would ever forget. The tension inside the cabin began to grow, quietly at first, like a storm waiting behind calm skies. The woman remained seated, her posture straight, her face unreadable. But Clara, the flight attendant, couldn't stop herself from glancing at her with irritation. Every time their eyes met, something inside Clara twitched, a strange mix of discomfort and pride. She didn't know why this passenger got under her skin. Maybe it was the woman's quiet confidence, or the way she never argued back, never complained. It almost felt as if the woman didn't fear her, and that bothered her deeply. A few hours into the flight, one of the wealthy passengers accidentally spilled a drink on the carpet. Clara rushed to clean it, all smiles and politeness, assuring him it was no problem at all. But when she noticed a small drop of water near the quiet woman's seat, water that wasn't even her fault, her attitude changed instantly. She frowned and said sharply, "Please be careful next time. We try to keep this cabin clean." The woman looked up, her eyes calm and kind. "It wasn't me," she said softly. "But I understand. I'll be careful." Her tone carried no anger, only grace, and yet the kindness in her voice made Clara even more irritated. She expected an argument, a defensive reaction, something to prove she was right to be rude. But the woman's peace made her own behavior look small. Moments later, a little turbulence shook the plane. A few passengers gasped. The quiet woman calmly reached for her seatbelt, tightening it again. But when she leaned slightly to pick up a napkin from the floor, Clara's patience snapped. "Ma'am, please stay seated," she said loudly in front of everyone. The woman froze for a moment and sat back quietly. But Clara wasn't finished. She walked closer, her voice rising. "You could cause a problem for the crew. Just follow instructions properly, all right?" A few passengers exchanged glances. One of them muttered under his breath, "She didn't even do anything wrong." But Clara ignored it. She was too focused on proving her authority, and too blinded by her assumptions to see the truth. The woman remained calm, but her patience was starting to fade. She finally looked up and said softly, "You shouldn't raise your voice like that. I did nothing wrong." Her tone wasn't angry, but it carried quiet strength. Something about the way she spoke made the cabin fall silent for a moment. Clara felt her cheeks burn. She hated being corrected, especially by someone she believed was beneath her. "Excuse me?" she snapped. "I'm doing my job. If you have a problem, you can take it up with the company when we land." The woman gave a small, sad smile. "Oh, I will," she said simply. That sentence hit Clara like a challenge. She thought the woman was threatening her, trying to act important. The idea that this plain-looking passenger could do anything made her laugh bitterly inside. She turned around, pretending to ignore her, but anger burned in her chest. Half an hour later, Clara passed by again to collect trash. The woman was writing in her small notebook, calm as ever. Clara stopped near her and said in a sarcastic tone, "Taking notes on how bad the service is?" The woman looked up, her eyes calm but sharp this time. "Just writing observations," she replied. Sometimes people reveal their true character when they think no one's watching. That single line was enough to make Clara lose control. The passengers nearby turned their heads, sensing the tension. Clara leaned closer and said coldly, "You're crossing the line. Watch your tone." The woman didn't respond. She simply looked at her and said quietly, "Respect is a choice. You should try it." And then, before she could stop herself, Clara did something that shocked everyone, even her. Her hand flew up and slapped the woman across the face. The sound echoed in the silent cabin. Every passenger froze. A collective gasp filled the air. The woman didn't cry out. She didn't shout. She just sat there, eyes locked on Clara, her cheek turning red. Her calm expression didn't break. It only grew colder, more powerful. Clara's hand trembled. For the first time, she realized what she had done. But her pride stopped her from apologizing. "You provoked me," she muttered weakly. The woman slowly stood up. Her voice was quiet but strong enough for everyone to hear. "You've made a terrible mistake," she said, "and I won't need to raise my voice to prove it." The pilot came rushing from the cockpit asking what happened. Clara stuttered, trying to defend herself, but the woman simply looked at him and said, "Please continue flying. We'll deal with this after landing." Her words were calm, but her eyes carried power, a kind of authority that no one could fake. Every passenger could feel it now. This wasn't just some random woman. There was something different about her. As she sat back down, the cabin remained completely silent. Clara stood frozen, the reality of her actions starting to sink in. She didn't know it yet, but she had just slapped the most powerful person on that plane, the very woman who owned it. Outside, the clouds glided peacefully through the blue sky. But inside the jet, a storm had just begun, one that would soon turn Clara's entire world upside down. The cabin had gone completely silent. The slap still echoed in everyone's minds like thunder after lightning. No one dared to speak. The passengers, who moments ago were sipping champagne and chatting softly, now sat frozen, their eyes darting between the two women, one standing in shock, and the other sitting calmly with quiet strength in her eyes. The woman's cheek was still red, but her composure hadn't cracked. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply took a deep breath and looked up at Clara, who was trembling slightly, though still trying to maintain her pride. The silence felt heavy, almost unbearable. Even the hum of the jet engines seemed distant. The woman finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "You don't realize what you've done," she said. Her tone wasn't angry, but there was something powerful in it, something that made Clara's stomach twist. Clara took a nervous step back. "You disrespected me first," she said defensively, though her voice wavered. "I was just—" The woman raised a hand gently, cutting her off. "Enough," she said. "You don't need to explain. I've seen enough already." She stood up slowly, her movements graceful and composed. Every passenger watched in awe, sensing that something far deeper was about to unfold. The captain peeked out from the cockpit, alarmed by the tension. "Is everything all right here?" he asked cautiously. The woman turned to him, her expression calm but commanding. "Everything is fine for now," she replied softly. "Let's just continue the flight safely. We'll discuss this when we land." Her words carried the kind of authority that made even the captain nod quickly, as if instinctively recognizing her power. He closed the cockpit door again, leaving the cabin in uneasy silence. Clara, meanwhile, stood still, her heart pounding. The passengers avoided eye contact with her, whispering quietly among themselves. A man in the front row shook his head in disbelief. "That was uncalled for," he murmured. Another woman whispered, "She's so calm. I'd never be that calm after being slapped." The woman sat back down, picked up her small notebook, and began writing again as if nothing had happened. But this time her expression had changed. The softness in her eyes had turned into something sharper, not anger but clarity. It was the look of someone who had already decided what to do next. Clara couldn't stand the silence any longer. She forced a nervous laugh and tried to speak to the passengers. I apologize for the disturbance. Everything's fine now." Her words sounded hollow, her usual confidence gone. The woman glanced up and said quietly, "No, Clara. Everything is not fine." The sound of her name made Clara freeze. She hadn't introduced herself to this passenger. How did the woman know her name? Clara's throat went dry. "How do you—" The woman closed her notebook and placed it neatly on the tray. "Names are easy to learn when you own the company," she said softly. A ripple of shock moved through the cabin. The passengers looked at each other, whispering in disbelief. Clara's face went pale. What? What do you mean? She stammered. The woman didn't answer. She simply smiled faintly and looked out the window, watching the clouds drift by. You'll understand when we land, she said. The rest of the flight felt endless. Clara tried to stay busy, but her hands were shaking. Every step she took felt heavy. The passengers avoided her gaze, some looking disappointed, others simply watching the quiet woman with newfound respect. As the jet began its descent, Clara's thoughts spun out of control. Could this woman really be who she thought? It didn't make sense. She didn't look rich. She didn't act like a billionaire. But the confidence in her voice, the calmness in her eyes, it all felt real. When the plane finally touched down, the woman stood up before anyone else. She didn't rush. She simply collected her small handbag and smiled politely at the passengers around her. Thank you for your patience, she said kindly. Safe travels to everyone. Her voice was warm, yet every word carried quiet authority. Clara tried to approach her, stuttering. Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The woman turned to her and said, No misunderstanding, Clara, just a moment of truth. And with that, she walked toward the exit. Outside the jet's window, black cars and uniformed personnel were already waiting. Clara's eyes widened in confusion and fear as she watched the ground crew rush forward to greet the mysterious woman. The captain, too, hurried down the stairs and bowed slightly as he opened the cabin door for her. The moment she stepped out, the air felt different, charged with realization. The passengers began whispering again. Clara's pulse raced. She couldn't take her eyes off the scene unfolding below. The ordinary woman she had disrespected wasn't just rich. She wasn't just powerful. She was the owner of the plane itself. And in that single quiet moment as the door closed behind her, Clara felt the full weight of what she had done crash down like thunder. The calm after the storm had finally arrived, but for her it felt like the silence before a downfall she could never undo. The wheels touched the ground with a soft thud, but for Clara, it felt like a crash. Her palms were sweaty, her heartbeat echoing louder than the roar of the engines. She tried to steady her breath as the plane taxied to a stop, but nothing could prepare her for what awaited outside. The quiet woman, the one she had insulted and slapped, was now standing in the aisle, calm and graceful, her expression unreadable. There was no anger, no arrogance, just silence that carried more weight than words ever could. The passengers remained seated, watching her every move. Even the most confident among them looked uneasy, sensing they had witnessed something much bigger than a mid-air argument. Clara forced a shaky smile and said softly, "We've arrived, ma'am, I hope. You had a pleasant flight." Her voice cracked halfway through, betraying her nervousness. The woman turned slowly and looked at her. For a second, Clara thought she saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "Pleasant?" the woman repeated gently. "Let's call it eye-opening." Then she picked up her small handbag and started walking toward the door. When the cabin door opened, Clara expected to see an ordinary airport scene. Ground staff, luggage carts, and perhaps a few maintenance workers. But instead, she saw a line of black luxury cars waiting near the runway. A group of men in formal suits stood beside them, one holding a folder and another speaking into a headset. The moment the woman stepped out, they straightened up like soldiers. "Welcome back, ma'am," one of them said respectfully, his head bowed slightly. The pilot, who had come down to greet her, also gave a small nod. "Everything was prepared as per your instructions." Clara froze in place. "Ma'am, instructions?" Her brain struggled to process what she was seeing. She looked out the window, her breath catching as one of the suited men opened the back door of a sleek black Mercedes for the woman, the same woman she had treated like a nobody. The passengers began whispering among themselves. One of them, the businessman from earlier, leaned toward Clara and said under his breath, "That woman, she's the tycoon who owns this airline. You just slapped the owner of the plane." The words hit Clara like a punch to the gut. Her knees felt weak. "No, that can't be true," she whispered. But then she saw it. The CEO of the airline standing near the cars, shaking the woman's hand with deep respect. His voice carried faintly through the open door. "We're honored to have you back. Ms. Lawson, your presence always keeps us grounded." Ms. Lawson. The name Clara had heard whispered in company meetings. The billionaire investor who had quietly bought the airline 6 months ago. The woman who preferred to stay out of the public eye, known for her intelligence, discipline, and humility. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The CEO looked up toward the plane and noticed Clara standing frozen. His expression turned cold. Then he turned back to Ms. Lawson and said quietly, "Is she the one?" Ms. Lawson didn't answer immediately. She simply looked back at the jet, her gaze meeting Clara's through the doorway. The look wasn't full of anger. It was disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper than any punishment. Finally, she spoke. "Yes, that's her." The CEO's jaw tightened. "We'll handle it immediately." Ms. Lawson nodded, but before leaving, she looked directly at Clara and said softly, "You have potential, Clara, but you let your pride blind you. Remember this, uniforms don't define respect. Humanity does." And with that, she stepped into the car and the door closed behind her with a quiet finality. The convoy of black cars slowly rolled away, leaving Clara standing in stunned silence, surrounded by whispers and judgmental eyes. The captain approached her carefully. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "the company wants to see you right away." Clara could barely speak. "Is she really—" The captain nodded. "The owner, the Tycoon, and from what I just saw, you might have just ended your career." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Her hands trembled as she sank into the nearest seat. The reality of what had happened finally broke through her pride. The woman she'd treated like a burden, the passenger she'd humiliated in front of others, had been testing her character all along. And she had failed, miserably. Outside, the sky was clear, the sun warm on the runway. But for Clara, everything felt dark. The sound of the engines cooling down matched the sinking feeling in her chest. She whispered to herself, voice cracking, "I thought I was teaching her a lesson, but she was the one teaching me." The flight was over, but the true turbulence had just begun, the kind that shakes not the plane, but the soul. Clara sat in the small, glass-walled office of the airline headquarters, her uniform still on, but her confidence gone. The silence around her was deafening. No chatter, no footsteps, no noise, only the faint ticking of the clock above her head. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, the slap, the gasp from the passengers, and the calm face of the woman she now knew was Ms. Lawson, the billionaire tycoon who owned everything Clara had ever dreamed of working for. Her supervisor entered, holding a tablet with trembling hands. "The CEO wants to see you," he said quietly. His tone carried no sympathy. Clara followed him through the long hallway, her heart pounding faster with every step. The once familiar walls of the company now felt like a courtroom, and every employee who glanced at her looked away quickly, as if she was already guilty. When she entered the meeting room, the CEO was standing by the window, looking out at the runway where Ms. Lawson's jet had just taken off again. He didn't turn around. "Do you realize who you struck?" he asked flatly. Clara swallowed hard. I didn't know, sir. I thought," he turned sharply. "You thought wrong. That woman wasn't just another passenger. She's the owner of this airline. The very reason you have a job, and you humiliated her in front of others." His voice was firm but cold like steel. Tears burned behind Clara's eyes. "Sir, I didn't mean to. I lost my temper, but He held up his hand to silence her. "Intentions don't erase actions, Clara. You didn't just lose your temper. You lost your respect for another human being." She looked down, ashamed. The weight of his words pressed hard on her chest. "I understand," she whispered. The CEO sighed and finally sat down. "Ms. Lawson doesn't want to ruin your life. She specifically told me not to fire you," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But she requested one thing, that you attend the new employee training program she's personally funding. It's about humility, empathy, and human respect." Clara blinked, surprised. She said that?" The CEO nodded. "Yes, she told me, but people like Clara don't need punishment. They need understanding. You're suspended for now, but she believes you can change, and if you truly want to." Clara felt her chest tighten, this time not from fear, but from guilt mixed with gratitude. The woman she had disrespected had every reason to destroy her career, but instead, she offered her a chance to grow. When Clara left the room, the building seemed different. Every face she passed reminded her of what she had done. She walked out to the parking lot, sat in her car, and finally let her tears fall. She whispered to herself, "She could have destroyed me, but she chose to teach me." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Her mind kept circling back to Ms. Lawson's calm words on the runway. Uniforms don't define respect. Humanity does. They echoed in her head like a prayer. For the first time in her life, she realized that true power didn't come from titles, looks, or status. It came from kindness and the one thing she had forgotten to show. The next morning, she went to the training center, unsure what to expect. To her surprise, Ms. Lawson was there, sitting among the employees, listening quietly as an instructor spoke about empathy and service. She wasn't standing at the front giving orders. She was sitting beside them, learning with them. When their eyes met, Clara felt her throat tighten. Ms. Lawson gave a faint smile and nodded as if saying, "You're here. That's what matters." After the session, Clara approached her slowly. "Ms. Lawson, I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said softly. Ms. Lawson smiled gently. "Forgiveness isn't earned, Clara, it's given, so people like you can learn to give it to others one day." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from relief. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in her job: purpose. Weeks later, when she returned to work, she wasn't the same person. Her smile was genuine, her tone soft, her heart open. Passengers noticed. Even her co-workers whispered about the change in her. And though Ms. Lawson never mentioned the incident again, she quietly observed from a distance, proud that her lesson had worked. The woman who once served drinks with pride now served them with kindness, and that small shift changed everything. Clara had learned the hardest way possible that respect isn't about who looks powerful. It's about who chooses to be kind when no one is watching. And from that day forward, she promised herself that no matter who sat in front of her, rich or poor, loud or quiet, she would treat them all the same. Because the true lesson Ms. Lawson had given her wasn't about punishment. It was about humanity. The story of that flight spread like wildfire. Within days, the incident was everywhere. On social media, in news headlines, and even on morning talk shows. Everyone was talking about the mysterious woman who had been slapped midair, only for it to be revealed later that she was the billionaire owner of the very plane she was flying on. But what truly shocked people wasn't the slap, it was her reaction. Instead of anger, revenge, or pride, she had shown grace. And that grace turned into a story that inspired millions. For Clara, the former flight attendant, life took a completely different turn. After completing the empathy training Ms. Lawson had suggested, she began volunteering at community centers, teaching young people about respect, equality, and emotional control. She often spoke about that flight, not to gain sympathy but to admit her mistake and share the lesson she had learned. "That slap ruined my pride," she'd tell people, "but it rebuilt my soul." Months later, Ms. Lawson attended one of these sessions quietly, sitting among the audience without announcing who she was. She listened as Clara shared her story with honesty and tears in her eyes. When the session ended, Clara saw her standing at the back of the room and froze for a moment. Then, without hesitation, she walked over and hugged her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me when I didn't deserve it." Ms. Lawson smiled and said softly, "We all lose our way sometimes. The important thing is finding the courage to walk back with humility." The two women talked for hours that evening. It wasn't a conversation between an employer and employee. It was between two people who had grown from a painful experience into something powerful and meaningful. Ms. Lawson told her about the new campaign she was launching for her airline, called Human Above All. Its message was simple yet profound, to remind every employee and passenger that kindness costs nothing, but means everything. Clara soon became the face of that campaign. In commercials, she shared her story openly, not hiding her mistake but owning it. Her honesty touched millions of viewers around the world. Messages poured in from people who had faced discrimination or made similar mistakes, but never had the chance to make things right. Clara's journey gave them hope that change was always possible. Ms. Lawson, watching all of this unfold, realized that her decision to forgive had done more than restored dignity. It had sparked transformation. She had always believed that true power wasn't measured in wealth, but in the ability to lift others even after being wronged. And now, watching Clara inspire others, she felt that belief more strongly than ever. One evening, After a long day of filming, Clara sat alone by the window of her small apartment, looking up at the night sky. For the first time in years, she felt peace. She remembered the woman she used to be, quick-tempered, judgmental, always chasing status, and smiled sadly. That woman no longer existed. The slap that once brought her shame had become the turning point of her life. The world eventually moved on to new stories, new scandals, new headlines, but this one stayed alive in people's hearts. It became a quiet reminder whispered between co-workers, taught in company workshops, and shared in motivational talks. Never underestimate anyone. You never know whose respect you're earning, or losing. And as for Ms. Lawson, she continued her travels in the same calm, simple way. No luxury displays, no need for recognition. But every now and then, a flight attendant somewhere would pause before speaking harshly, remembering that story about the billionaire tycoon who taught the world a lesson in humanity without ever raising her voice. The slap had been a mistake, but what came after that was destiny. A painful, powerful reminder that respect is the one currency that never loses its value, no matter who you are or how high you fly. Years had passed since that unforgettable flight, but the story still lived in people's hearts like a timeless lesson. What started as a shocking moment in the sky had transformed into something far greater, a movement that changed how people treated one another. Across the world, airlines began adopting Ms. Lawson's Human Above All program, using it to train their crews not just in service, but in empathy, patience, and respect. Clara, once the disgraced flight attendant, had now become a respected voice in the aviation industry. Her life had turned full circle. She traveled from city to city, standing before thousands of employees and sharing her truth. But even as she stood on those big stages, her voice never lost its sincerity. She often began her talks by saying, "I once thought uniforms gave me power, but I learned that power is nothing without compassion." Her words struck a chord with everyone who listened. One day, Clara was invited to speak at a global aviation conference in New York. It was a huge event, attended by CEOs, pilots, and airline owners from around the world. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience gave her a standing ovation. But when she spotted Ms. Lawson in the front row, quietly clapping with that same calm smile, Clara's eyes welled up. That one silent nod from her mentor meant more than any applause in the room. After her speech, reporters rushed to interview both women. When asked how she found the strength to forgive someone who humiliated her, Ms. Lawson replied, "Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I didn't forgive her because she deserved it. I forgave her because the world needed to see what grace looks like." Her words went viral overnight. Millions of people shared her interview, calling it the billionaire's lesson the world needed. In the following months, the story inspired a documentary titled The Slap That Changed the Skies. It told the full journey, from the incident to the transformation that followed. Viewers were stunned by the emotional honesty, especially when they saw real footage of Clara's talks and Ms. Lawson's message about dignity. The film became a global sensation, winning awards and sparking conversations about kindness in everyday life. But beyond fame and recognition, something more beautiful was happening. At airports around the world, flight attendants began writing small notes for passengers. Messages like "Have a peaceful journey" or "Thank you for flying with us." Small gestures, but deeply human. It was as if Ms. Lawson's message had taken flight on its own, carried by thousands of hearts. Years later, Clara retired from flying but continued to mentor young crew members. She often visited training academies, standing quietly in the back while new recruits watched the video of her story. Some of them didn't even know it was her until she stood up at the end and said softly, "That was me. I was the one who lost my temper that day, and I was given a second chance, not because I earned it, but because someone believed I could be better." The room always went silent after that. As for Ms. Lawson, she continued her legacy quietly, expanding her airline but never losing her humility. She never boasted about her wealth or status. Instead, she made sure every cabin crew member, from the newest recruit to the oldest captain, knew her by name, not by title. One evening, years later, Clara received a handwritten letter sealed in elegant paper. It was from Ms. Lawson. The letter said, "Dear Clara, the world changes through people who grow, not people who give up. You grew. And because of that, thousands now fly safer, kinder skies. Thank you for proving that one mistake doesn't define a person. Their response does.
With respect, Ava Lawson. Clara held the letter close to her heart, tears slipping down her cheeks.
She realized that what began as an act of humiliation had become a lifelong journey of redemption and purpose. And though the story started with a slap, it ended with something far more powerful, forgiveness that healed not just two people but the world around them. Because sometimes one act of grace can echo farther than the sound of anger ever could.